welcome everyone. This is the one-year anniversary of the Leaders in DEI series with Berkeley Global, and to celebrate this occasion, we have invited Vice Chancellor Dania Matos to make some remarks. Dania began her tenure as Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the UC Berkeley on August 16, 2021. And she came to Berkeley from UC Merced, where she served as the inaugural Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer since 2019. Over the past decade, Matos has led equity and inclusion work through private, nonprofit, and government sectors, and she has led UC Merced's diversity efforts, where she was the inaugural Deputy Chief Officer for the College of, is also the inaugural Deputy Chief Officer, Diversity Officer for the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. She served as the Public Defender's Office in Virginia, where she saw firsthand how the criminal justice system harmed underrepresented communities. So she brings a wealth of experience, and we're so excited to have you join us today. Welcome, Dania.
Thank you so much, Jill, and such an honor to be with you on your one-year anniversary. Happy anniversary. What a celebration. And I'm so excited that Jarvis Sam is here to help us celebrate. Like so many institutions of higher ed, the murder of George Floyd in June 2020 sparked our reckoning with our enduring legacy of slavery, and as well as what we would do to combat racial justice and to fight for it. So this was part of the series that ignited one of those changes. All UC Berkeley employees were encouraged to take action, and things like our Becoming an Anti-Racist UC were born, as well as this series. UC Berkeley Extension and the Expanding Diversity and Gender Equity in Tech, or EDGE in Tech initiative, partnered to co-design a speaker series that would feature corporate leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion so they could share their journeys and insights that they've gained while advocating for these issues in major corporations. And I'll tell you, that is such a treat, because no one gave me the path to becoming a Chief Diversity Officer. So I'm so excited to see what this is, and hopefully spark so many of you into this career that's so rewarding every day. Guests share their stories and what it means to be the head of diversity and inclusion in a large company today. We explore them in their career progression and what it's like, as well as lessons learned that they can pass on to other companies, and to all of you aspiring DEIBJ leaders, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice. All of the events are featured on YouTube, so they are accessible, and we've already had more than 1,000 views. That is so exciting. Throughout the series, we've had a variety of speakers from companies like Kayak, OpenTable, Uber, Coursera, Siemens. I see so many that I use, T-Mobile, Walmart, Thumbtack, Zendesk, and Groupon. There's only 2 more left in 2021, this one, and including ending the year with another one, PayPal. We have over 11 events. This is our lucky number 12, with over 1,000, almost 2,000 registrations. This is really exciting. Over 71% of people are attending from the US, and we have 29% from over 50 countries across the world. So to you, I say, welcome, bienvenido, bienvenue. I only speak 3 languages, so I have to work on the other 50 to be able to do so. So hello to those from Brazil, Canada, China, Cyprus, France, and so many more. And with that, I thank you, I welcome you. I hope this sparks the change we want to see in the world. And thank you for having me. I'll turn it back over to Jill.
Thank you, Dania, and welcome to Berkeley, and thank you for being one of the leaders in DEI. We're really pleased to have you join us today. As you mentioned, we're super excited to have Jarvis Sam join us today. And before I introduce him, I would like Christina Pinckney, our Academic Design Manager and Custom Programs team from UC Berkeley Extension, and my co-moderator, to have a chance to introduce herself as well. Christina.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. I'm Christina. As Jill mentioned, I'm Academic Design Manager in the Custom Programs team at UC Berkeley Extension. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for the one-year anniversary of this series. It has been an excellent series and program, and we're just so happy it can be shared with so many people, whether it's via YouTube or people who can join live. I also want to thank you again, Jill, and EDGE in Tech for partnering with us to produce this series. We've been so fortunate to welcome so many impactful leaders who can share their knowledge and experience with us and really give us that inside view. So that's just been awesome for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm excited to have you join. It's always great to bring in new people with great experiences to kind of share in these conversations. I reminded everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to those at the end, but let me start by introducing our conversation today with Jarvis Sam, who is Vice President, Global Diversity and Inclusion at Nike, and recently named Forbes 30 Under 30 in Sports Class of 2021, as well as Portland Business Journal's 40 Under 40. In his current role, he oversees a team of driving diverse representation, inclusive leadership, and social justice education, professional development, and the ecosystem of promoting and creating a culture of belonging both inside and outside Nike. Prior to his current role, Jarvis held various roles, acquiring new talent capabilities, driving large programs, partnerships, and initiatives to impact representation and accelerate the flow of Nike's diverse talent pipelines. Additionally, he led Nike's candidate experience, talent attraction, and employer branding efforts, driving the best-in-class approaches and strategies to amplify the company's employment voice and obsess the candidate. I'm interested to learn more about that. Jarvis frequently works with sports marketing function and product teams to execute on key initiatives with signature Nike athletes like Serena Williams, league partners like WNBA and NFL. Prior to Nike, Sam worked as the head of diversity and inclusion at Snap Inc., which has done some really impressive work lately with the ACT report, the Accelerating and Catalyzing Inclusion in Tech report. He was responsible for building the company's first ever DEI strategy and drove technology recruiting approaches to scale the company's 6x through IPO. Sam also worked at Google as a diversity program manager and led part of the diversity recruitment practice there. Jarvis is a graduate of Rice University, where he studied history, public policy, and sports management with an emphasis in race and gender rhetoric. Jarvis will receive his MBA from Brown University in May 2022. In his spare time, and this is most important, Jarvis does musical theater, most recently acting as Jimmy Early in the production of Dreamgirls. He loves film, sports, karaoke, and can be seen doing a rendition of Tina Turner's greatest hits around Portland, Oregon, where he resides. Welcome, Jarvis. And, tell us your story. And in particular, when we think about Nike, that's not your standard tech company. So tell me how you got there and what does diversity and inclusion look like at Nike?
Yeah, good morning, Jill and Christina. It is such a great pleasure to be connected with everyone here, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the various global teammates that are joining us around the world. I really am excited to be here to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of a really exciting experience that I had the great and humbling opportunity to be a part of last year, and the great work that the Edge team and Berkeley Extension continue to do to elevate these vitally critical conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly the role that it plays in academic spaces as well as professional spaces. But by way of background, appreciate the conversation around the bio, Jill. A couple of pieces not highlighted there. As I mentioned before, my name is Jarvis Sam. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I do proudly serve as Nike's Vice President for Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. For anyone on the call that may be visually impaired, I am a Black male. I wear my hair in cornrow braids. I have on earrings, a button-down shirt, and a leather jacket. And I certainly want to offer an acknowledgement of the space in which Nike resides. Nike's world headquarters sits in Beaverton, Oregon, but it's critical that we recognize this, particularly during Native and Indigenous Peoples Month, the fact that we reside in space previously occupied by the Tualatin Valley, and specifically the Chiquipi people. When we think about experiences of the erasure of history of Indigenous populations, it is critical that we all recognize our own experiences and the land with which we occupy to be able to have and facilitate conversations like this. So I would be remiss to not offer that. In terms of my journey, I was originally born and raised in Houston, Texas. I am a proud Texan native. You'll probably hear me say y'all throughout this conversation a couple of times. But my passion for this work has existed for years. In seeing the way inequity showed up, and it wasn't lost on me, of the disproportionate impact of prison rates for Black and Latino men, I began to focus my attention a lot there throughout my undergraduate career. writing scholarship and policy analysis on that very topic, but also juxtapose that work by doing scholarship work and understanding the impact and legalization of annexation for the Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian people, in the 1890s and 1950s. I found myself constantly surrounded in the sphere of wanting to understand where and how elements of equity played out and how they impact minority or marginalized populations. From there, I did jump into a career actually in strategy consulting, but I quickly realized it wasn't for me. And in fact, in working at various different companies across various different industries, I frequently saw the same experiences of inequity play out in workplaces. And so when I had the opportunity to step into the equity and inclusion space at Google, it was certainly something that resonated with me. It was being able to combine that academic passion into something in professional spaces. And so now, as I bring this work to life at Nike, my goal is to be able to respond to one simple question: how can we leverage our voice and platform to create a beautifully congruent experience for marginalized communities between the impact on our consumers, our elite athletes, and our employees?
Thanks so much,
that's
Jarvis.
fantastic.
Go ahead, Jill.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Christina.
I was just going to jump in to ask if you could tell us a bit more how Nike is positioned in the tech space and how you see Nike and your DEI actions interacting with the tech space, because as Jill mentioned, we don't really see Nike traditionally as a tech company.
Yeah, what's really interesting, Christina, having spent nearly a decade in the technology industry, when we think about tech companies or traditional tech companies, we often view it through the lens of those that are digitally native or digitally enabled. It's the essence of my experience at Google and Snapchat. And so I think as people think about how to drive those connections, we think about the general profile of those companies as heavily built engineering organizations that focus on the development of specific digital products, whether it's Snapchat's either Snap product or Google's various products, ranging from Chrome to search or otherwise. However, people don't traditionally put Nike in that same bucket. However, the advent of COVID-19, and even with work that we did years before that as part of our consumer direct offense, we have been elevating and amplifying our approach to what tech enablement looks like and driving digital engagement. Nike has an over 10,000 person global technology organization doing amazing work to amplify our various tech platforms, everything ranging from Nike Run Club to Nike Training Club, the sneakers app, which I know so many on the call use to try to acquire that high heat product, Nike.com, and so much more. These technologies build systems and platforms that help the consumer connect with Nike in a way that's truly direct. Our retail stores, of course, those serve a very powerful role in this as well. If you've been into a Nike retail store lately, you'll notice there's a ton of technology that helps drive and bring consumer experience to life in a beautifully productive way. And so I think that we're going through an effort right now of redefining what is a tech company and changing the face of what tech companies in tradition look like. Because for companies to survive the future, especially in light of efforts like inclusive supply chains, shifts to approaches to procurement, it's going to be that much more critical that we start thinking about what digital access and enablement looks like. In addition to that, we are hiring a ton of technologists. So if anyone on the call is in fields or spaces of data analytics, data science, software engineering, or otherwise, definitely make sure to check out jobs.nike.com.
What role do you see Nike have in creating more role models or representation in tech through sports?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of students, particularly those that are early in career, the idea of connecting where and how sport directly aligns to technology is a foundational question. For a lot of folks, we represent the essence of culture. Whether it's performance culture to provide the best footwear, apparel, and equipment products to the most elite athletes in the world, to our ability to actually serve athletes through our various digital platforms. For students in undergrad, the idea of getting to work on some of the most cutting edge technology approaches at a company like Nike is beyond meaningful. And so it provides the opportunity to jump into a space or an industry that is so foundational and so impactful, and to be able to do it at a company that literally is creating the future of sport. And so whether we're doing work with historically Black colleges and universities or Hispanic serving institutions, we talk about that value proposition so much more. Behind me, these apparel products that are Nike manufactured, it's more than just the jerseys of Damian Lillard, LeBron James, or Steph Curry. It is a whole collective team that works across innovation, consumer, product, and ultimately in our digital spaces that bring it to life. And I think that value proposition is becoming far more appealing to folks that are early in career.
I think that idea of blending your specific passion, your interests with your technology skills, with your career goals, and kind of growing in that area is something that, everybody really targets, right? Like, how can I bring my passion and my work experience together? How did you go from Google and Snap to Nike? What was that transition like?
Yeah, Jill, I have always had a passion for sport. Early in my tenure at Rice, I was set on studying history and public policy because I knew that working in those spaces of social science and humanities, I would acquire a lot of knowledge that would help me to understand how to impact the world of business quite different. I knew early on that while I love academia, I was not set on becoming an academic, and yet I wanted to use non-traditional and some traditional academic approaches to change the way business operations work at a company. However, it was in my junior year that I found what that application could look like when I began to explore opportunities with Nike's sport management department. Through working a variety of different jobs on campus, one of the roles that I played was as a tutor to many of our student athletes. And in addition to that, I had done speech and debate for a number of years. And so as a teaching assistant for the public speaking class, I was deeply connected with a lot of our athletes. And so, they highly encouraged me to connect more with the sport management major. And after looking at the course catalog and seeing that I could complete the work over the next 2 years, I decided to take it on. And what I immediately saw, Jill, was there was no distinction or separation between all of the great topics and conversations that I had already engaged in on race and gender and human sexuality with the sports industry. And in fact, there was a huge opportunity to take those learnings and knowledge and start to build it in. Because despite incredible efforts that are being taken on by Nike, the WNBA, and so many others, elements like transphobia and homophobia continue to persist in the sports industry. And so there's an opportunity for us to create a refined and renewed approach to how we engage in these conversations. And so the transition then of going from, tech startup at the time that I joined to post-IPO company with Snapchat to Nike was one where I saw the opportunity to bring the digitally native attributes that are Snapchat to a company that is driving incredible digital transformation, and at the same time, build up on the academic profile that I had understood from sport management into the work we do here at Nike.
Awesome, thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your mandate at Nike? For instance, in your own words, how does Nike define diversity and inclusion and equity? And then does your C-suite support you? Do you have and or need leadership buy-in, so to speak?
Yes, so leadership buy-in is beyond critical to being able to do this work in a productive way, Christina. What I often highlight to people, though, is it's a threefold approach. The leadership buy-in represents the top-down approach. It is executive commitment that says this work matters, and we're going to commit both human capital and financial resources and investment to make sure that it actually happens. And so we also, though, need a bottoms-up approach. This is the grassroots activism that I think many companies experienced, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. This is your employee networks, your resource group saying, these are the topics of discussion that are important to us, and this is why they matter. What's often missing, though, from that formula is the third, middle out. An individual's experience is largely impacted by their day-to-day line manager. That's where the biggest impact happens. And oftentimes that manager's experience and education of that manager is often neglected. We chose to change this experience. So our mandate is charted up against 4 key areas: representation, education, development, and community. Representation centers around how do we ensure that we have a representative focus of individuals that are coming together from a variety of different backgrounds, experiences, cultural context, etc. The definition of diversity. But in addition to that, we focus on education because from my perspective, Education is the critical prerequisite to driving inclusion and belonging. What I mean by education is, how do we respond to the question of how did we get here? And where was I potentially complicit in the marginalization of a community? Following the murder of George Floyd, many individuals sought resources to understand the Black experience in America and abroad. What was often missing from that was a stated focus on educating ourselves to understand how we got here, and how periods of antebellum enslavement, how a focus on the lack of rights access and disenfranchisement all contributed to that experience that becomes the Black experience in America. By focusing on the education attribute for people managers, we're able to change the game and change experiences such that when you get to development, they feel a part of the narrative and part of the conversation around how we drive mentorship, how we drive sponsorship, and ensure that we're able to enable our employees to achieve their career aspirations. Finally, last but not least, when we think about what community truly means, it's how Nike is impacting not only our internal employee base, but how we create inclusive and accessible marketplaces, how we shift the agenda in procurement to drive what many companies call supplier diversity, we dub as business diversity and inclusion, and so much more, like our $140 million commitment to the Black community. It's these efforts that we put together to create an ecosystem to focus on inclusion.
Thank you so much. That is such an excellent view of how it works both internally and externally, which I know a lot of people are also interested in hearing. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
A lot of different prongs, right? Because you're talking about what you're doing with the consumer, what you're talking about, what you're doing with the employee, the supply chain, even product development. When you look at trying to do all of these things, how do you keep momentum, especially as you're saying, in light of George Floyd, in light of a lot of the social justice issues that have been coming up? There's a lot of diversity fatigue. So how do you keep people moving forward and making incremental progress?
It starts with systemic change, Jill. You know, when I talk to a lot of equity and inclusion practitioners, whether in academia or in the private sector, we oftentimes hear about DEI work being done through a deeply programmatic lens. It is stand up new program with XYZ HBCU to attempt to acquire new talent. What's not happening though in that regard is we're not assessing the candidate experience. We're not focusing on our employee experience to try to drive retention in a much more productive way. Diversity fatigue largely comes from this idea that we're trying to handle so much at one particular time, and we're not actually taking a piecemeal approach to saying what is important to drive community engagement and solidarity at this time, and then elevating and moving past that, because all of these concepts build on each other. By educating people around the experiences of marginalized communities, when we talk about the erasure of Native and Indigenous history, when we talk about this themed model minority persona that's often placed amongst the AAPI community, we have to understand sociologically, where did this come from? And so then how does that impact an individual's day-to-day life? We oftentimes talk about this concept of bring your whole self to work, but that's not the experienced reality of a lot of marginalized communities, unfortunately. And so the onus is then on the company to ensure that we're creating the right environment to incentivize a culture of belonging. The avoidance of diversity fatigue has to start with understanding who's on first in this regard and where accountability exists. I had the humbling opportunity yesterday to connect with one of our amazing teams that are driving some work in our North America Marketplace unit. These individuals came together as a task force and connected with DEI for expert guidance and resourcing, but they delivered a program themselves to drive transparency and engagement to how we talk to our marketplace partners about the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is how we start to drive and facilitate real impact, is through this avoidance of everybody jumping in spaces where they may or may not have expertise and overall tiring out. Rather, by focusing on what is in our locus of control and really elevating that and catalyzing that, you end up making some really significant progress on all fronts.
I really like that. What's in your locus of control, and what is your sphere of influence? How can you, and what does this look like in your role? So I'd love for you to say more about that, and a little bit more on this idea of assessing like the candidate experience and breaking these things down into these components?
Yeah, I'll start with the latter, Jill. When I think about what an employer value proposition is, on the candidate side, it's really responding to the question of why am I coming here? On the employee side, it's why do I stay here? When you think about the essence of what a value proposition means to an individual, especially in the current marketplace, in the current labor market, there is such a pool for talent, especially talent that has great digital backgrounds and digital experiences. And so to obsess the candidate experience means that we look to every element from what I call the first time we say hello or talent attraction, all the way through your first day, or what we call running start, our onboarding experience. And talent needs to see that their experiences are centered in what the company believes to be valued. And so when we talk about talent attraction, this includes everything from what we post on the Nike Instagram to the Nike LinkedIn, to how your consumer experience is, to the number of people that you're interviewing with. What does the demographic composition of the people that you're interviewing with look like? And then how do we go through a process of talking about and explaining roles-based approaches to you? It also includes elements of the job description itself. Like many companies, we work with an external vendor that does amazing work with us to ensure that our job descriptions have both gender and racially neutralized language, so not to create systems of bias that put people out of the process before they've even had the opportunity to talk about their skills and experiences. We partner closely with our talent acquisition organization to do 2 trainings a year, focused not only on diversity recruitment, but the role of the recruiter in creating a truly equitable and inclusive experience for the candidate journey. It's more than just having a separate diversity sourcing or diversity recruiting team. We need to ensure that everybody, from recruiters to hiring managers, coordinators, et cetera, are all a part of this collective journey at driving and advancing equity and inclusion. That's where we have a big differentiator in how we think about the candidate experience. Recognizing that there is an obligation in certain spaces to think about candidates and talent differently represents really that first piece. You start translating some of those ideas to how you handle, navigate, and obsess the employee, and you start to drive retention.
One last follow-on on that. If you're an applicant, how do you know a company is legitimately doing the work versus, celebrating Juneteenth and then checking that box?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Jill. It centers around consistency. I talk a lot about consistency and congruence. I'll use the Juneteenth example, actually. So following the murder of George Floyd, many companies sent out emails to those that are a part of their sales mailing list or otherwise affirming their support of Black communities, many of which showcased either Juneteenth as a day of education, some closed down, etc. It was quite a disheartening experience for me as a cisgender Black male professional, but also as someone in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, to see not all of those companies return to the table in that support of Juneteenth. But Nike did. I was in New York City on Juneteenth. And again, as a Black man from Texas, I knew about and celebrated Juneteenth, Jill, before I knew about what July 4th was. It's just what you do when you're from Texas. And so I was in New York City and passed by our store on Fifth Avenue. And I would see, I just stopped and waited. For me, it was a bit of ethnographic research. I waited and watched nearly 100 consumers pass by, planning to go shopping at Nike that day. As they pulled on the door, you could see them reading the text that we wrote as we put a banner on the door, highlighting that in honor and celebration and commemoration of Juneteenth, Nike was closing all of U.S. operations, including manufacturing, distribution centers, retail, and our corporate offices, so that people could recognize and understand the impact of Juneteenth as a holiday. In addition to that, we had a little QR code on the side taking people to the website for the National African American History Museum. The common theme that I saw, people would pass by, read, nod, and have a little smile on their face, because for them, it represented the Nike that they know. It is consistent, it is on brand with that experience. And so as a candidate, you expect to see that congruence and consistency between how a company is positioning its statements connected to topics like race, support of various gender identities, human sexuality, support for women in the workplace, and so much more. And then you want to have that be your felt experience as you're going through the interview process.
Jarvis, I really hung on that word that you said about the collective journey. And I think the example you gave is actually a perfect lead into a question I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Nike is such a large organization. How do you make sure these changes are happening across the entire organization? And for you personally, what changes would you like to see, or what changes are you working on making right now?
Yeah, really great questions, Christina. The way that we build this across the organization really has to start by ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion is everybody's job. Oftentimes when we talk about DEI, it's often positioned to only serve racial or ethnic minorities, to only serve gender minorities, to only serve military veterans, the LGBTQ plus population, etc. And so it can leave what often represents the majority of corporate spaces in America, cisgender, straight white males, out of the conversation. That's not an equitable system. Rather, we have to ensure that everybody sees DEI as part of their job, their journey, and part of their accountability. What it does, Christina, is it ensures that no one's off the hook for this very important work. And it allows you to elevate standards of accountability by saying, we're all in this together. One of the Nike maxims is win as a team. And we truly believe that to create the future of sport, to serve athletes the best, we have to focus on high performance teaming. And so by ensuring that everybody sees diversity, equity, and inclusion as their job and as part of their experience, then we're able to create this collective understanding connected to the work. One of the education partners that we work with is Dr. Alvin Tillery, who runs the Center for Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. And he has his CREED method, which is an approach for how we drive sustained social and racial equity, where he spends a lot of time in civil rights scholarship. The C, though, of the CREED method is common purpose. And that's the essence of everything that we do, is building around common purpose. In March of this year, Christina, as we start to see heightened rhetoric around hashtag Stop Asian Hate, conversations came up the world over beyond Nike of people saying, is our advocacy in this space going to limit our support efforts surrounding the movement for Black lives? This was a very troubling experience and troubling rhetoric for me to hear, because it then positions the work that we do for marginalized communities as a zero-sum game. One such that we cannot support Black and Latino communities and also support Asian American communities and not explore the intersections that exist for transgender and non-binary communities or LGBT communities that are part of that work. It is a perspective that we can't expand the pie, but rather have to keep cutting it until it's so small that we're not having an impact on anyone. We have to avoid that perspective and center the idea of solidarity. Solidarity means, as communities of color, as marginalized groups, we come together and say, our fight is a fight of continued experience, where absent the support of everyone, we cannot win. Oftentimes, I hear disabled communities left out of this conversation, and many of us using ableist language about our experience, and yet not recognizing the fight for the movement for Black lives is not devoid of experiences of disabled Black folks. I oftentimes see a bit of distinction between the LGBTQ plus movement and that of the movement for Black lives. To be clear, the Human Rights Campaign recently released a note just last week highlighting that the number is 44. That is the number of trans women of color that have been killed in this country in 2021 alone, the highest over the last several years. Now, the CDC called this an epidemic 3 years ago, and yet the numbers continue to rise. Solidarity is a potential solution to changing that. We just got to go for it.
Thank you. I was thinking as well, you said you want to make DEI everyone's job, but when you do that, I'm sure you will eventually encounter some resistance. So when you do encounter folks who do not want to be involved, or who, aren't interested in this kind of issue, supposedly, how do you respond to that? And how do you really make sure that you can kind of bring them on board?
It starts with a bit of a redefining of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, Christina, and where it sits. Like, if we continue to position DEI purely as a talent program or talent initiative, then yeah, it's easy for people to not see it as part of their job. If I am not a hiring manager, meaning I will not be acquiring talent, or I am not a people manager, meaning I am not accountable for developing or retaining talent, then I can immediately jettison approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion as not my job. Systemic approaches, though, to DEI center it as part of the business. What's funny, Christina, a lot of firms will talk about the amazing work that Deloitte and McKinsey and Company have done to prove out the business case for DEI, and then yet not drive it connected to their diversity, equity, inclusion, and business operations offense. That's where we're a bit different by design. On purpose.nike.com, you can find our goals for 2025, and you'll notice a couple of things. One goal is to have a $1 billion spend commitment out of our procurement organization connected to business diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is tied directly to business operations. It is that for our procurement organization to continue to drive and be successful, we have to engage with minority suppliers. Similarly, we set some very aspirational and audacious goals, like a 45% female VP population representation, a 30% and above racial and ethnic minority perspective here in the US. Those are goals that we know are uniquely connected to how we build and drive our business. And so to answer your question directly, when you're met with resistance, point people to the business outcomes and the business rationale of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because then it becomes a very different conversation for how we hold people accountable. It's not centered around, and this is important too, but it's not centered around a deeply humanistic or social scientific approach to DEI, and rather deeply centered in the essence of business practice and the work that we do connected to business. That tends to make the resistance go away when you start to tie it to the essence of what people's role is and what their job is. Understanding, though, that folks are still on a learning journey.
For sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the kind of built-in accountability there. It's part of it's your job goal. You need to get here. How are you best going to get that goal met? And here are some ways and some tools to meet that goal. As we think about like hiring, and there's been a lot of changes that has happened to hiring. So I'm curious your thoughts about the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms in choosing your candidates. The role of like sustainability and climate, does that play a role in hiring? Because a lot of the Gen Z folks are very concerned about the climate, and remote work. Because of COVID, it's become kind of an expectation from employees that this is something that would be available. How is that changing your recruiting and hiring processes and how you think about these policies in the company?
Jill, now you're getting me super excited about this work. I did a panel about 3 weeks ago with Noel Kinder, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Nike and a good friend of mine. And one of the pieces that we were discussing, the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot start or stop with talent. It cannot start or stop with, quote, business operations. There is a unique link between how we are having discussions around climate change and the impact on minority communities. Take, for example, the research and literature that is featured out in the ether right now that highlights that a 2-degree increase in the planet's temperature results in a over 40% greater likelihood that Black communities, especially Black children, will get asthma. A 4-degree warming of the planet, an over 56% greater likelihood. The stats speak for themselves. Climate justice and the fight against impending climate change is uniquely an issue of equity because of the spaces and places where in marginalized communities, and specifically Black communities, Latino communities, and Native and Indigenous populations work, puts them at a greater risk of impact. Anybody working in agricultural spaces, particularly throughout Central America, have a really high potential impact of what will happen as global warming continues to persist. But when we think about it from the lens or vantage point of Nike, a company that's centered around sport, in March, the Winter Olympics are going to be happening in Beijing. The Winter Olympics will look dramatically different in the next 8, 12, and 16 years if we do not control the effects of global warming. What I mean by that, we will only be able to hold the Winter Olympics in certain geographies where enough snow is actually produced so that signature events like snowboarding, for example, are still able to happen in outdoor spaces. The way that sport is continually impacted by climate change, our focus on ensuring that kids can actually be active, that they can find and participate in sport and making sport a daily habit is contingent on our ability as a world to control the impact of climate change and global warming. I highly encourage everyone on the call, look at some of the scholarship and literature that's being written that draws a connection between efforts around critical race theory and global climate change. Because as we talk about social justice of the future, Yes, the same socioeconomic and political challenges that exist in the status quo will be there, but climate justice will be the topic that will be one of the biggest areas of impact or focus. And here's the beauty, Jill, when we start talking about diversity amongst generations. Millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha are so acutely connected to these topics and have such knowledge and are writing scholarship and are so deeply engaged in the essence of what these topics mean that for companies, when we talk about our purpose agenda, one rooted in people, planet, and play, it's not just what you do. It's no longer simply CSR. It is the essence of how you run your business to be able to attract the right talent, create connections with the right partners, drive the right impact on the world.
I love everything you said there. And we're actually doing a symposium on advancing climate resilience. And one of the panels is on how air quality is affecting people's health and animals' health. And being on the West Coast, you're familiar with the impacts of the wildfires that we've had. So it's really exciting to hear that that's part of the conversation. Let me turn it over to Christina for one last question, and then we're going to go to our audience because there are a lot of questions stacking up, and I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we want to get to as many as we can. So Christina.
Certainly, yes, I see the questions rolling in, so I will try to make this quite succinct. What does success look like in your role? Specifically, what are you measuring and what kind of data do you collect to make sure you are successful?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Christina. The way success is defined, when we talk about this strategy focused up against representation, education, development, and community, monitor and measuring and having a metrics framework is beyond critical. We often highlight this old adage of what's measured gets done, but beyond that, if you don't have a system to understand, are we driving and creating the right type of progress, you've missed the mark. And so we look to a couple of different things. Internally, there's obviously representation. And as I mentioned before on purpose.nike.com, some of our representation goals that we're looking to move toward around representation for women in the workplace and racial and ethnic minorities in the workplace are featured there. We believe that this accountability, both from an internal and external standpoint, is beyond critical to ensure that we are creating the composition that reflects the essence of who our direct consumer is. But it can't stop there. We focus on driving inclusion by having what we call our inclusion index, which is featured in our annual employee engagement survey, where we seek to understand what our employees' experiences like in the workplace and where and how do we think about the essence of driving and the continued creation of a culture of belonging. Beyond that, external benchmarking plays a critical role in this. When we think about the impact on LGBTQ plus populations, for example, we participate annually in the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. I'm proud that for 19 years, we've scored a 100 on the CEI. In addition to that, we participate in Disabilities In's Disability Equality Index. We partnered this year as one of the founding partners for MLT, or Management Leadership for Tomorrow's Black Equity at Work Index. All of these different benchmarks and indices and approaches to measurement help us to be able to frame a consistent and congruent story to the world around how we are showing up to support our employees. What does this mean in terms of consumer experience and how we are showing up as a leader in this space? To be clear, there is still so much work to be done, Christina. We're not celebrating the work or the wins because Nike often upholds a mantra that there is no finish line. However, we do celebrate the checkpoints along the way because we believe and are hopeful that if we open source our strategy, if we have conversations like this that will be posted for the world, hopefully other companies, particularly smaller companies, startups, or those in development that may not have budget or resourcing to fund a chief diversity officer, hopefully they can pick up nuggets of truth or impact here that will impact how they are thinking about company development, from hiring to retention, development, obsessing the consumer, etc. That's my main goal of what success might look like.
I like what you're saying there because it's not about incremental work. It's about how you do the work. You're doing the same work, but how can you do it in a way that's more inclusive and more effective? So that's very exciting for any company, any size.
And Jill, it's not, we have to get out of this mindset that it's a competition, particularly around diversity recruitment. Like, I want to see our competitors amplifying and elevating their approach to diversity recruitment, because then we all win. There is a wonderful endeavor right now called 110 that Nike is a part of. It is an effort to get 1 million Black Americans into jobs, good jobs in America over the next 10 years. It is a endeavor that we are a part of, largely started and founded by Ken Chenault, the former CEO and chairman at American Express, and Ken Frazier. And the essence of that is that the talent pools are there. The pipelines are there. We have to figure out how to create access and opportunity within our own four walls. And if there are nuggets of truth that other companies can pick up on to be in that with us to ensure economic empowerment of marginalized communities, that's a win.
That's fantastic. And I just posted the link to 110 in the chat. We're actually doing a new course next semester, a challenge course to look at opportunity tech. How can we use technology to increase access to opportunity and future of work jobs? So I'm excited to learn more about that, and I'll follow up with you. But let's go to Chris Claremont, who asks, how do you ensure DEI outside of the HQ to various Nike locales and spaces around the world? I think many employees don't feel the DEI in a retail consumer-facing space, and they hear all this is happening at the HQ.
It's a really great question, Chris, and thanks so much for asking. There's a couple of things. When we think about how we define our journey and focus on representation, education, development, and community, it doesn't start or stop at our world headquarters. It has to extend beyond that. And so I actually spend a good amount of time partnering with, listening to, and engaging with our teammates in retail, manufacturing, as well as our distribution centers, largely in Memphis and St. Louis. When we think about the impact that's made on those communities, there has to be a focus on career. And in communicating and talking about these teammates in particular about what career is, what it looks like, and how we support them, we got to build infrastructure around that. And it starts with how we build our teams. So I'm thrilled to highlight, I have a teammate who actually sits out in the Memphis marketplace and supports those teammates from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint in much of the central US, so specifically St. Louis and Memphis. In addition to that, I have a teammate that sits out in Texas that supports all of our retail teams or our Nike Direct teams. And this is a big journey for us. When I think about looking at other companies, those populations that are often sitting at the margins, Chris, are typically very much left out of the conversation. We have to start recentering their experiences beyond just this focus on corporate to ensure that all teammates have an equitable access and engagement with what we are seeking to build and how we're positioning it. And so it's certainly going to be a journey over the next 2 to 5 years, but it's one that I am deeply committed to. And you'll likely notice part of our Purpose 2025 targets as well, there is one feature there around how we market and create opportunities in corporate for those that are in distribution centers, retail, and manufacturing.
Thank you for that very detailed answer. We have a question from Derek Austin. How do you hold leaders accountable? For example, is DEI part of their performance evaluation?
Yeah, so we feature this on purpose.nike.com as well, but we do have a target connected to that. So certain elements like the driving of representation, access to education is tied to what we call LTIP. It's a long-term incentive plan for our VP and above leaders. It's really how we focus on that idea of the top-down approach. It has to be more than just a stated commitment, Derek. We have to ensure that people are actually performing through the work. You know, where many companies position education opportunities following work around racial and social equity, that ultimately was a 1 or 2 hour session that leaders sat through, checked the box, and moved on. We put our leaders through an intensive. They went through a 12-week program with Northwestern University focused on topics of racial and social equity. And we hit on some hard topics ranging from how abrasive or communication, particularly microaggressive communication, impacts minority experiences so that our leaders begin to think differently about that work. We're partnering with the University of Southern California and their Center for Race and Equity with Dr. Sean Harper, along some of the work that they do as well on navigating conversations for trans and non-binary identities in the workplace. What this does, Derek, is it creates a baseline of expectation such that when you then put in place accountability standards tied to performance, tied to compensation, tied to engagement results and inclusion index results, it makes sense. And you can be even more stern and finite. It becomes a binary. Did you achieve these goals or not? And so it enables the accountability to look very different and be far more productive. I think what we'll see in the next couple of years, Derek, is a lot of scholarship written about this, particularly on how to drive accountability. You know, we've seen great literature written. Isabel Wilkerson's Cast is a really powerful text in this space. Obviously, Dr. Ibram Kendi's work on how to be an anti-racist is really powerful in this space. And I believe that that gets us to the space of understanding the what. Scholarship that will subsequently be written around accountability will help us to understand the how.
Yeah, I like that idea of being explicit, being clear. We know a lot of bias can creep in when there's gray areas. So having the expectations really clearly set is great. Taylor asks, what are some of the DEI blind spots that you see in Nike or sports tech? Are some of these issues your next goals?
Great question, Taylor. I think where all companies should be obsessing right now is this focus on intersectionality. Historically, the diversity, equity, and inclusion space has often centered on looking at communities as finite groups or populations, and what's more, often evaluating them through the lens of a monolith. The challenge with that is marginalized populations are far beyond a monolith. And when you start talking about experiences of those that sit at the intersection of those, how you engage and provide support for them has to look fundamentally different. The movement for racial justice, the WNBA was so far ahead of many other leagues in their support of it. Those amazing women said from the very beginning, we will not play. We will advocate for, we will be allies in this work. We will drive real and productive change. They are leading in this space and in this regard. As a result, Nike has continued to partner with the WNBA to provide career opportunities for WNBA players upon retirement. We currently, as of 2 weeks ago with cohort 3 starting, we currently have 40 retired WNBA players that work at Nike in our product creation suite over the last 3 years. They're full-time employees and they work across elements like product inclusion, design, product creation, etc. And so as we think about the biggest area that's going to be a watch out for us, Taylor, it's going to be ensuring that we're focusing on intersectionality, because we can't simply put opportunities in place to support Black communities because it will inevitably bias in favor of Black men. We have to focus on experiences of Black women and understanding what does that intersectional experience truly mean for her, and how do we build strategic approaches to ensure that she is elevated and amplified, and that her voice is not only positioned through this lens of a seat at the table, but rather a voice in the conversation that is connected to making real and apparent impact.
I really like your comments there, and especially in light of the Olympics and women wearing bike shorts or not wearing bike shorts. Yeah. Like these type of things, we have to challenge the criteria, we have to challenge the expectations, and why were the rules set that way? Maybe the rules don't need to be set that way.
Yeah.
You've given us many, many examples of Nike's kind of outward-facing actions that they're taking to make sure that they're being equitable and expanding equitability in the space. Could you give advice, a question from Tyrone Quarterman, for those who work in this space and have been tasked with this challenge of changing the public perception around a company that might not have been as active in the space but wants to do better? Could you give some advice?
I love this question, Tyrone, and I'll take us to a little bit of the literature and scholarship around equity. The advent of equity as juxtaposed by the philosophy of equality is one that centers basically on 2 key principles, where equality argues that we're going to provide the same resources and focus and experiences and access to everybody in the exact same way, failing to give due consideration to the fact that we're all from different starting points. Equity centers itself around that. However, the second piece that people leave out of conversation around the philosophy of equity is that to truly build an equitable environment requires that we highlight where we may have been complicit in the marginalization of communities. What this means is that for companies, many of which that may be 100-plus-year-old companies that were around during periods of antebellum enslavement, that may have taken loans or been the provider of loans, for example, to plantation owners who were driving systems of enslavement, we got to talk about that. We have to highlight where we were complicit in the marginalization of Black populations for years. And then what does that mean in terms of our advanced efforts to rethink and redefine how we advocate for, support, and drive allyship in this space. What's often missing as companies try to rewrite their narratives is an avoidance of talking about the issue. There are many companies, for example, that have historically released a variety of statements that many would highlight are homophobic or transphobic. We have to talk about that, talk about the damage and impact that has been created on the community, and then let's have a discussion for how we're bringing the community in to drive and facilitate education authentically, and then get to how we're giving money from a philanthropic perspective. Where many companies move to, Tyrone, to try to fix the agenda is simply gift giving, money giving. The challenge with that is, especially in an area where it may have been elements of cultural appropriation or even culture vulturing, it looks like hush money. And so we have to be really conscious of that. We overcome that by highlighting the wrong in our actions, bringing the community as part of the conversation, because that builds up on authenticity. As a cisgendered Black man, when I am having conversations or building strategic approaches to support individuals with trans and non-binary identities, I bring those individuals to the table. That way, I am not entering with a biased perspective where my, quote, power and privilege is creating a space that speaks for them or on their behalf. Rather, bring them into the conversation and then start to figure out who are the best organizations that I should be hiring from. Who are the best organizations that I should be providing philanthropic support to? Who are the best organizations that I will be contributing to personally?
Building on that, Suki Sandhu says, thank you, Jarvis, for including Indigenous and Asian American communities in the Nike DEI conversation. Too often these stakeholders are left out of the conversation. Could you explain particular measures with the Indigenous people, their empowerment, and with the Asian community around, in the context of anti-Asian hate? Is there's a lack of Indigenous and Asian Americans in the sporting industry, in the DEI space? How is Nike being a voice?
Suki, thank you so much for this question. I'll tell you a little bit of a personal experience. Anyone that's connected with me on LinkedIn, you probably saw it featured there as well. But I had the opportunity about 2 weeks ago at the front of Nike's world headquarters. We have a ton of flags that are featured there, which are namely countries where Nike has done or is doing business. Every November, though, in honor and celebration of Indigenous Peoples Month, we remove a couple of the flags and elevate 20 plus flags that represent Native and Indigenous tribes. I had the humbling opportunity to raise the flag of the Kanaka Maoli, or that of Native Hawaiian people. But we had flags raised from various different tribes, from the Lakota to the Dakota. But Nike's been in this work for a number of years. One of my good friends is Sam McCracken, the GM of N7. N7 is a footwear, apparel, and equipment product that Nike has worked on for a number of years under the stewardship of Sam to bring to life the voice of Native and Indigenous populations through what we do at Nike. Sport and the reflection of that and the platform that we have has such powerful potential to bring culture front and center to the table. We do the same with the Black community through our BHM product, with LGBTQ communities, with our Pride product, with a variety of different product suites, including our LHM or Mi Familia product during Latino Heritage Month. For us, talking about experiences of Indigenous communities has to be nascent for what we do. Let's be clear, we are all on Native land. Specifically, though, at Nike, we have identified that where tribal governance actually exists to where the land with which our world headquarters is placed upon. Suki, that comes with a big accountability, where we have to not only talk about, but to, and celebrate and advocate for this community on an ongoing basis. And that means focusing recruitment efforts. It means celebrating and supporting activities like the Indian Athletic Hall of Fame, which we supported in Missoula, Montana just a couple of weeks ago, and so much more. Amplifying the voice of this community helps us to ensure that all boats rise along the way, so that we're driving solidarity in a productive way. Speaking about the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, we have to start that conversation, Suki, by first of all, separating the community. We cannot talk about Asian American populations as a monolith anymore, because the experiences of those of South Asia is different than those from Southeast Asia, is different from those in East Asia, and everything in between. In addition to that, there are intersections of minority experiences. Take one of our Nike athletes, famed tennis player Naomi Osaka. who has both Haitian background and Japanese experiences. Naomi's experience in Japan is quite different than that of, quite frankly, anyone else. And so we center perspectives of Asian American identities because for far too often, these identities are left out of the conversation. We elevate this perspective of the model minority, which leads us to believe that because representation is there, we've done our job. Rather, if we don't focus on ensuring that these populations are included and celebrated, we end up with issues like we saw early this spring, where without the proper coverage, engagement, and allyship, we're in a perpetual cycle of #StopAsianHate. I firmly believe that we can shift this by focusing on the experiences of these various different communities. But what we got to do is make sure that we are not picking at each other unnecessarily. If we cannot stand by and support each other as allies and advocates, the entire plot line is destroyed. We seek to do this by creating a platform through our product and our brand marketing to bring to life these voices. But the human component means that each and every one of us has to be part of that journey to elevate and amplify experiences of others. So I really appreciate that question, Suki.
Well, thanks so much. Just to finally round it out for you yourself, how do you make sure you're taking care of yourself as you're doing this work and engaging with such complex issues?
Yes, mental health and a focus on mental health awareness is beyond critical. I think that the population that so many forgot about as we navigated the pandemic, as we navigated what some called one of the most heightened moments of experiences with racial and social equity, is the DEI practitioner. Folks have been on the front lines in navigating these rather complex conversations, advocating for racial and social equity, advocating for understanding the intersections of that experience, and so much more. But specifically for those of us that are also part of racial and ethnic minority groups, we're being impacted personally and professionally. And at times we have to compartmentalize those efforts and turn off one element of it so that we can be there to support others. I have focused so heavily on mental health the last several months and in over a year to rethink what this approach looks like. So I meditate every morning. I meditate in the evening. Focusing on reflections of what is important, what is, to returning to that phrase, within my locus of control, but also what do I want to build? It is critical that we all find and take time and space for self. I've often heard narratives, Christina, about the impact of COVID-19 on families and what schooling looks like and parents having to be both professionals and teachers. The conversation that I think is often left out, though, is the role of people that live alone. People that have been navigating the pandemic as what I call a solo practitioner. The impact of isolation, particularly for those extroverts like me, it's tough. And it's in an environment where conversations like depression and anxiety aren't top of mind. You know, we launched what we call an I Speak campaign with our Ability Network, where we focus on elements of experiences with disability that have impacted you. And so you say, I speak, and what that is. And it can be experiences being a caregiver and supporting family members around you. And so I often say, you know, I speak depression, I speak anxiety, because I have seen family members directly impacted by that. And so I focus so heavily on centering my own mental health. And when it's time to take a break and when it's time to drive rest and recovery, that becomes priority. And I highly encourage everyone else to take full advantage of that as well.
That's fantastic. I'm going to roll 3 questions together. They're sort of related. So
Okay.
Ashley is wondering about your thoughts on DEI related hiring practices. And Derek is wondering, what are some of the, highlighting some of the ongoing metrics that measure success or failure? And I think perhaps synthesizing it best, Gadis asks, can you speak more about how do you assess DEI metrics that impact systemic level change? How do you know it's working?
Yeah, 3 really great questions. I'll try to hit them quickly. So DEI related hiring, I think hiring is critical. What we have to focus, because it's one of the key elements for how we drive representation. What we have to focus on, though, Ashley, is language matters here. And, you know, at previous companies, I have heard recruiters talk about diverse candidates. And you can tell the way they speak about the candidate is inherently otherizing. I struggle so hard with the term purple unicorn, which people use to describe when they find a Black female veteran talent. That's offensive. It's otherizing. It takes away the experiences that she has worked so hard to craft in service in the military, in service in professional spaces, to then position it down as a, quote, purple unicorn, a figmented, imagined creature. We have to avoid elements of otherization in DEI-related hiring. We also have to avoid this common misnomer where we believe that to focus on diversity hiring comes at the expense of a loss of time or engagement or ability to achieve business results. It's just not true. The work that's highlighted by McKinsey and Company in Diversity Matters enables us to see the impact that DEI has on driving productive outcomes from a business perspective. Financial outperformance to the tune of 35% is what their studies have found. This means that even in a world where it may take you longer to assess and evaluate pipelines by amplifying and obsessing the focus on diversity within your talent pools and pipelines, it's gonna be worth it in driving innovation of product, purpose, as well as achieving some of your business operations and sales goals. So Ashley, my thoughts on DEI-related hiring is that it is an absolute business imperative, but I highly encourage companies to ensure that your recruiters, your coordinators, and your sourcers are going through training ahead of time to understand how to talk to and about this talent in a way that's going to be more impactful. On the metrics related question, I talked about a couple of the metrics that we use and evaluate previously, but when we talk about the driving of real systemic change, we got to identify what are the systemic problems that we're actually looking to overcome. One of which may be the barrier to entry, for example, that's created in corporate spaces for Black or Latino talent. A systemic metric to evaluate that is, are we actually seeing a greater flow in the talent that's applying to our jobs online, in the talent that we're sourcing, in those that are interviewing, as well as in those that are getting hired? Because if we focus on demystifying and dismantling unconscious and conscious biases that can come up in these spaces, then we are shifting or changing where and how the systemic problem has persisted to create a systemic solution that enables opportunity and access.
I love that. And, the whole idea of the unicorn job description is one of the things that has to go away, where you think you can find somebody who has all these 25 credentials and experiences and years of experience. I see people saying you need, 10 years of experience in cybersecurity when the technology is changing so rapidly. Like the last few years are all that matter, right? So yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Well, let me turn it over to Christina. I think we got time for one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, yeah. The thing that you said about the unicorn job description really made me also think about how this whole great resignation is making all of us come to kind of a reckoning with what it looks like to either be hiring or starting your career or moving to your next move in your career. So Jarvis, could you give some recommendations actually to someone who wants to start a career in DEI right now? It's from Anonymous, unfortunately, but again, we'd all love to hear your thoughts on that.
I was really hoping we would get to this question. I've seen a lot of impact, and I get this question quite often these days, Christina, and I provide two answers. Here's the first. I think that a lot of people want to jump into the DEI space because of the real impact that you can make on companies and organizations, especially right now. People enter from the perspective of passion and purpose, and it's beyond critical, and I value and celebrate that. However, I highlight to people, if the rationale that I highlighted at the top of the call is true, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is everybody's job, could you also demonstrate practitionership, if not expertise, practitionership in the DEI space through your own role? I truly think that's possible. I think a vice president of procurement at an organization, a procurement manager at an organization, a software engineering manager at an organization can drive DEI in ways, quite frankly, that I can do a lot from the space of expertise, but they're the ones hiring the future engineers of the company at scale and in mass populations. They arguably have an even greater locus of control than even myself on how to impact concepts like representation. And so that's the first answer, is really figure out, are you trying to go into a space of scholarship and expertise in DEI? Or do you simply want to be a part of the work and support it because of the passion and purpose? Because that can certainly be done in another space or field of your business, and in fact, be quite powerful. Second, if you are actually interested in exploring it from the perspective of expertise, I tell people, study a couple of the books that I highlighted earlier. I love Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi, any of the scholarship or work by Dr. Randall Kennedy from Harvard University. Of course, the text on intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw are really great starting points to get the academic foundation. I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion, similar to other fields of expertise, whether it's degree programs like an MBA, a JD for attorneys, an MD for doctors, so on and so forth, I believe that real expertise and practitionership in DEI has to come with an understanding of foundational sociology and psychology, as well as humanities-focused work, anthropology and history in particular, because it gives you the factual history and the account through both primary and secondary resources and sources to understand why we do the work that we do. It goes beyond the idea of just hiring an Asian American woman to the company. Understand that her experiences in the workplace and where and how she shows up, particularly depending on her own experience or familial background, may be directly impacted by sociocultural or historical traditions like Chinese exclusion or Japanese exclusion in this country for many years before. It may have to do with this establishment of model minority rhetoric, where she feels obligated to act a certain way or silence her voice accordingly. Knowing those details helps us to build strategies that will last for a long time, but also that are foundational and fundamental to the human experience in your companies.
Yeah, I read How to Be Anti-Racist and also Caste, so I agree with you 100% that you really need that foundational knowledge that I honestly did not learn in school. So I recommend those books so much, and I think a lot of people would be surprised by what they learn about our own history and how it's been kind of taught to us. So it's very, very important.
Thank you.
We have just a few more minutes, so I want to give you a chance, Jarvis, to wrap up with any comments or topics that maybe you didn't have a chance to address, and final thoughts. That we have, of course, in our audience, students, we have DEI leaders and practitioners who are already in the field. We've got individual contributors and company, startup and tech people. So what would be your thoughts you'd like to leave them with?
Yeah, I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey. The topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I never saw myself 10 years ago being a DEI practitioner, sitting in forums like this and then talking about how that expertise has been developed or built. And so just know that the path for your engagement to this work and practice, it starts with you consuming media differently, reading differently, food consumption and engagement in the culture of others differently. What I'll leave you with is remember, I've built a model that focuses on how we do this effectively. It starts with education, taking the time to learn different approaches so that you can support communities in a way where you are a tried and true advocate and ally. It then goes to understanding. This is where we actually take the time to start to build and draw those connections, responding to the question, how did we get here and what role did I play? Then it centers on empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is, I feel sorry for that person. Thoughts and prayers. I hope their experience improves. Empathy, rather, is where we actually take a moment to say, what is the macro outcome of this experience? Microaggressive behavior is rooted in fear. It's rooted in separation. It's rooted in dichotomy of experiences or approach. Understand, what do those experiences feel like? That's how we drive empathic leadership. And then from there, action and advocacy. So education, understanding, empathy, and action. For me, that has become a formula for how each and every one of us can drive great work and impact, whether we're in academia, public sector, or private sector, or a student in school.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. We really appreciate your empathy and time and understanding, and I hope we have sparked a new generation of empathetic, inclusive leaders out there. I want to thank Christina for your contributions and thoughtfulness, and also sharing all the books in the chat. Thank you. I know people are very excited to kind of follow through on that. I want to thank the Berkeley Thank you. I want to thank Berkeley Global for all of their support, putting this series together. This has been a tremendous experience. I learned something every single time, something new and something exciting. And so I appreciate that this venue and this conversation exists. And I mostly want to thank our audience for being invested in these issues and taking the time to really talk about these important topics and expand upon what we can do in this space. I will say this is our last event in the series will be coming up in December, and that's going to be with Kim Jenkins, Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion and Belonging at PayPal on December 14. But we hope you all have a wonderful holiday period. We hope you join us for that last talk. And again, thank you, Jarvis, and thank you, Christina.
Thank you.